Jenna found what she thought was a distressed puppy shivering in her backyard one chilly morning. Concerned for its well-being, she rushed to the local vet, cradling the small creature gently in her arms, hoping for a miracle. But the moment the vet laid eyes on it, his face blanched, and his next words sent a shiver down her spine. "This isn't a puppy. It's something much more dangerous, and keeping it is illegal." Jenna was left dumbfounded. Why was the vet suddenly raising his voice? Wasn't she doing the right thing by bringing in the pup? Confusion was written all over her face, but the vet's patience wore thin. "I'm dialing the police," he declared. "You won't get away with this." Jenna's heart sank. "Wait," she yelled as the vet walked away. "What have I done?" The vet locked the door behind him, locking Jenna inside the examination room. She ran to the door, trying desperately to open it, but it was in vain. She banged her fists against it, hoping one of the people in the waiting room would raise alarm. But no one heard her. Or worse, no one cared. She was left alone, not knowing what was going to happen to her. A little while later, she heard the police sirens coming to a halt in front of the veterinarian clinic. She heard the muffled sound of officers walking up to the examination room, and soon after, they were standing in front of her. "Mrs. Sanderson, you have the right to remain silent." But why did the vet call the police? What kind of animal had Jenna brought to the vet? And why was she being arrested? The morning started off rather exciting. Jenna was refilling her bird feeders when she heard a faint whining sound coming from the bushes. It wouldn't be the first time a wild animal would visit her garden, as she lived along the edge of a forest, so she curiously brushed the leaves to the side. Little did she know, she wouldn't be finding something like a cute deer. She gasped when she saw a tiny animal shivering from the cold, its fur soaked and its eyes closed. Without hesitation, Jenna ran inside to grab a small box and a towel to place the animal in. As soon as the animal felt the warmth of the towel, it snuggled up against it, and Jenna began to dry it off. Suddenly, the animal began to growl at Jenna, and it even tried to bite her finger as she petted its fur dry. Jenna pulled back in shock because of the sudden aggression the animal was showing. She looked at her hand in disbelief, but was relieved when she saw it wasn't scratched. She wasn't very keen on getting a rabies shot anytime soon. She decided it was best to bring the animal to the vet, thinking it was a puppy that needed to be looked at. She drove over there, the pup by her side curled up in the corner of the box. She had called the vet as she left home. Jenna was a regular at the clinic. Dr. Thompson had treated bunnies, cats, and even squirrels who had wandered into Jenna's yard. Arriving at the clinic, Dr. Thompson was already waiting for her. He had a small window between his appointments to look at the pup, but it wasn't long. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice," Jenna said as she walked through the door. The vet nodded. "No problem, but you do owe me a lunch break," he jokingly said back. They headed into examine room 2 together, and Jenna placed the pup on the table. The vet looked at the pup intently, raising an eyebrow. "You said you found it in your garden," he asked her. Jenna answered honestly, not realizing the questionable tone in Dr. Thompson's voice. "Yeah, and it almost bit my finger off," she joked. But Dr. Thompson wasn't smiling. "What is it?" Jenna asked worriedly. Dr. Thompson sighed as he stepped back, his face stark. "This is illegal. You know that, right?" he asked her. Jenna's heart began to race as she shook her head. "What do you mean? This is just a puppy," she confusedly answered. She had no idea what the vet was getting at, but she would soon find out. "What do you mean?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Thompson's expression hardened. "This isn't a puppy, Jenna. It's a wolf cub, and it's illegal to keep one as a pet." He grabbed the phone from the wall. "I'm calling the police," he said firmly. Jenna's mind raced, her heart pounding. "But I didn't know," she exclaimed. "Please, don't do this." But Dr. Thompson's mind was made up. He dialed the number, leaving Jenna feeling helpless. Jenna watched in horror as Dr. Thompson exited the room, locking the door behind him. She lunged for the door, rattling the handle frantically. "Dr. Thompson!" she shouted, banging her fists against the door. Her calls echoed in the empty room. The small wolf cub whimpered in the box, oblivious to the chaos. Jenna's panic rose as she realized she was trapped. The walls seemed to close in, the silence deafening. She needed to find a way out. Jenna slumped against the door, trying to process what had just happened. "A wolf cub?" she muttered to herself, glancing at the small, trembling animal. How could this be true? She had only wanted to help. Questions swirled in her mind. Why was Dr. Thompson so harsh? What would the police do to her? She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had to stay calm and figure out what to do next. Panic wouldn't help. Jenna's desperation grew. She pounded on the door again, louder this time. "Can anyone hear me? Help!" she screamed. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear any response from the waiting room. Silence. She banged harder, her fists aching. "Please, someone!" she cried out. The wolf cub let out a small yelp, mirroring her distress. Jenna's eyes filled with tears. She had never felt so alone, trapped in a place that should have been safe. The minutes dragged on, each second amplifying Jenna's fear. She called out again and again, but no one came. The stillness of the room was suffocating. Jenna's thoughts raced. Why wasn't anyone coming to help? She felt abandoned, her hope dwindling with each unanswered plea. The reality of her isolation hit hard. She sank to the floor, hugging her knees. The wolf cub's soft whine was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. She had to find a way out. Jenna glanced around the room, searching for any possible escape. Her eyes landed on the air vent high up on the wall. Could I fit through that? She wondered aloud, desperation seeping into her voice. She stacked a chair on top of the examination table, climbing up precariously. She peered into the vent, the metal grate cool against her fingers. The opening seemed just big enough. Jenna took a deep breath, hoping this would be her way out. Jenna struggled to squeeze through the vent, her shoulders too broad to fit. She grunted in frustration, wiggling back out and collapsing onto the table. "This can't be happening," she murmured, tears of helplessness welling in her eyes. She felt trapped, both physically and emotionally. The small room seemed to close in on her, and her mind raced. There had to be another way. She couldn't give up now, not when so much was at stake. Suddenly, strange noises erupted from the box. Jenna's head snapped toward it. The wolf cub was making unfamiliar sounds, a mix of growls and whines. The aggressive noises sent chills down her spine. She had never heard an animal make such eerie sounds before. The cub's eyes glowed with a wild intensity, and it snapped at the air. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest. She inched away, keeping a wary eye on the small, fierce creature. Jenna took a step back, maintaining a safe distance from the box. The memory of the cub's earlier aggression was fresh in her mind. She didn't want another close call. The cub growled again, its tiny teeth bared. Jenna shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I just wanted to help you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She felt a pang of sadness, mixed with fear. The cub was dangerous, and she was trapped in here with it. The sound of police sirens cut through the silence, growing louder by the second. Jenna's heart sank. She wasn't sure what she had done wrong, but the fear of losing her freedom was overwhelming. She glanced at the door, her mind racing. The sirens were close now, almost at the clinic. Jenna's breath quickened. She felt cornered, like a caged animal. "Please, let this be a misunderstanding," she prayed, her voice shaking. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her. The door burst open, and police officers flooded the room, guns drawn. Jenna's eyes widened in terror. "Don't move!" one officer barked, his voice firm. She froze, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely think. The small wolf cub cowered in the box, its growls turning to whimpers. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with fear and confusion. Jenna felt like she was in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Tears streamed down Jenna's face as she slowly raised her hands. "Please, I can explain," she sobbed, her voice trembling. I didn't know it was illegal. I thought it was a puppy in need." Her words tumbled out in a frantic rush, desperate to make the officers understand. But their faces remained stern, their eyes focused. Jenna's heart ached with fear and helplessness. She felt the weight of the situation crashing down on her. Ignoring her pleas, the officers moved swiftly. One of them grabbed her wrists, snapping handcuffs on tightly. Jenna winced at the cold metal biting into her skin. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer recited, his tone devoid of sympathy. Jenna's mind spun. This couldn't be happening. She hadn't done anything wrong, at least not on purpose. The reality of her situation hit hard, and she felt her legs grow weak beneath her. The officers led Jenna out of the examination room, her heart pounding with fear and confusion. The clinic's bright lights seemed harsher now, each step echoing loudly in her ears. She glanced back at the small wolf cub, still cowering in the box, and felt a pang of sadness. How had things gone so wrong? The officers' grips were firm, guiding her through the hallways. Jenna's mind was a whirlwind of questions and dread. The clinic's waiting room fell silent as Jenna was escorted out by the police. Patients and staff stared, their eyes wide with shock and curiosity. Jenna kept her head down, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She felt like everyone was judging her, assuming the worst. The walk to the police car seemed endless, each second stretching into an eternity. As the doors opened, Jenna took a shaky breath, bracing herself for what was to come. In the back of the police car, Jenna's mind raced with questions and fears. "What have I done?" she thought, tears still streaming down her face. She couldn't comprehend how things had escalated so quickly. Will I go to jail? The uncertainty gnawed at her, each second feeling like an eternity. Her thoughts were a chaotic jumble, mixing panic with the desperate hope that there had been some mistake. She felt utterly alone and confused. Jenna glanced out the window, straining to see the clinic one last time. She hoped to catch a glimpse of Dr. Thompson or the strange animal that had caused all this trouble. The sight of the clinic fading into the distance made her heart ache. "I just wanted to help," she whispered to herself, feeling the weight of misunderstanding pressing down on her. She wondered what would happen to the cub now, alone and scared. As they drove away, Jenna realized there was nothing to see except the clinic's closed doors and the concerned faces of the people inside. The sense of finality hit her hard. "They all think I'm a criminal," she thought, her stomach twisting in knots. She saw no sign of Dr. Thompson, no indication of what was happening with the wolf cub. The reality of her situation was sinking in, and it felt more surreal by the minute. The ride to the police station was eerily silent, save for Jenna's occasional sobs. The officers in the front seat spoke in hushed tones, their words indistinguishable. Jenna's mind wandered, revisiting every moment of the day. How had a simple act of kindness turned into this nightmare? Each bump in the road jolted her back to harsh reality. The silence was suffocating, leaving Jenna alone with her spiraling thoughts and growing sense of dread. Jenna's thoughts swirled with confusion and worry as the police car approached the station. "What will they do to me?" she wondered, her anxiety mounting. She thought of her home, her friends, her life turned upside down in an instant. The image of the wolf cub's fierce eyes haunted her. "I didn't mean any harm," she repeated to herself, trying to find some comfort in her innocence. But the uncertainty of what lay ahead overshadowed everything else. At the station, Jenna was led into an interrogation room where two stern-faced detectives awaited her. The room was cold and sterile, the air heavy with tension. One detective, a tall man with sharp features, gestured for her to sit. The other, a woman with piercing eyes, watched her intently. Jenna's heart raced as she took a seat. She felt like she was sinking into a dark abyss, her fear and confusion only growing stronger. The detectives placed a stack of papers in front of her, detailing laws about illegal animals. Jenna's eyes scanned the documents, the words blurring together in her anxious state. "These are the regulations you violated," the male detective said, his voice cold and unwavering. Jenna's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, feeling overwhelmed. She couldn't believe this was happening. Each paragraph felt like a nail in her coffin, sealing her fate. Jenna, bewildered, tried to explain she found the animal and had no idea it was illegal. "I didn't know it was a wolf cub," she said, her voice shaking. "I thought it was a stray puppy that needed help." She looked at the detectives, hoping for a glimmer of understanding. "I called the vet as soon as I found it. I wasn't trying to break any laws." Her words spilled out in a desperate plea for mercy. The detectives listened, but seemed unconvinced by her story. The woman leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You expect us to believe you had no idea?" she asked, skepticism dripping from her tone. The male detective nodded in agreement. "It's hard to buy that you didn't recognize a wolf cub," he added. Jenna's heart sank. She could see the doubt in their eyes. No matter how truthful she was, they seemed determined to see her as guilty. Jenna's anxiety grew as the interrogation continued, feeling trapped in a nightmare. Each question felt like a trap, and every answer seemed to dig her deeper into trouble. She could barely think straight, her mind clouded by fear and exhaustion. "Please, I'm telling the truth," she repeated, her voice growing weaker. The detectives exchanged glances, their expressions unchanged. Jenna felt the walls closing in around her, the room's oppressive atmosphere making it hard to breathe. Hours passed with more questions and mounting frustration for Jenna. Each inquiry felt like a test she was failing, her patience wearing thin. "I've told you everything I know," she insisted, her voice strained. The detectives, however, seemed relentless, their skepticism unwavering. Jenna's head throbbed from the endless interrogation, and she felt trapped in a cycle of suspicion and doubt. Her hope of resolving this nightmare began to fade, replaced by a deep sense of despair. Every answer she gave seemed to lead to more suspicion from the detectives. "Why didn't you recognize it wasn't a dog?" the woman pressed. "You said you've dealt with animals before," the man added, his tone accusatory. Jenna's frustration bubbled over. "I didn't know," she cried, tears of exasperation in her eyes. "I was just trying to help." But the detectives exchanged doubtful glances, their disbelief palpable. Jenna felt herself sinking deeper into hopelessness. Suddenly, one of the detectives received a phone call and stepped out. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the air thick with tension. Jenna watched him leave, her heart pounding. She glanced at the remaining detective, who continued to scrutinize her with piercing eyes. The moments dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. Jenna's mind raced, wondering what the phone call could mean. She felt a flicker of hope, but quickly suppressed it. Jenna was left alone with the other detective, who eyed her intensely. His gaze felt like a spotlight, exposing her every thought and emotion. She squirmed under his scrutiny, trying to maintain her composure. "You need to understand the seriousness of this situation," he said, his voice low and steady. Jenna nodded, too exhausted to respond. The weight of his stare bore down on her, making the room feel even smaller and more suffocating. The room's tension grew as Jenna waited, unsure of what would happen next. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and erratic in the silence. The detective's unblinking eyes added to her anxiety. Every passing minute felt like an eternity, the uncertainty gnawing at her. "What are they planning?" she wondered, her nerves fraying. Jenna shifted in her seat, trying to stay calm, but the oppressive atmosphere made it nearly impossible to think clearly. When the detective returned, he had a new piece of evidence: surveillance footage from the Wildlife Reserve. He placed a laptop on the table, the screen flickering to life. Jenna's heart sank as she saw the time-stamped video. "We found this footage from the night the animal escaped," the detective said, his voice heavy with implication. Jenna's eyes widened as she leaned closer, dreading what she might see. Her mind raced, searching for any possible explanation. The footage showed a figure resembling Jenna near the reserve's fence the night the animal escaped. The grainy video played out, revealing a shadowy figure moving stealthily. "That's not me," Jenna blurted out, her voice cracking. She watched in horror as the figure tampered with the fence, allowing the wolf cub to slip through. The resemblance was uncanny, sending a chill down her spine. "I swear, it's not me," she insisted, but her confidence wavered. Jenna was stunned and insisted it wasn't her, but the resemblance was uncanny. "You have to believe me," she pleaded, tears welling up again. "I was home that night. This is some kind of mistake." The detectives exchanged looks, their skepticism deepening. Jenna's hands trembled as she tried to make sense of it all. "Check my phone records, my texts, anything," she begged. But the footage spoke louder than her words, casting a dark shadow of doubt. Doubt began to cloud Jenna's mind as she wondered how this could be happening. She replayed the night in her head, trying to remember every detail. Could she have been near the reserve without realizing it? Was someone setting her up? The questions gnawed at her, each one more unsettling than the last. Jenna felt her grip on reality slipping. How could she prove her innocence when the evidence seemed so damning? The detectives' suspicion deepened, complicating Jenna's situation further. "This footage puts you at the scene," the male detective stated flatly. "And your story doesn't add up." Jenna's heart pounded. She could see their patience waning, their minds made up. "Please, just give me a chance to prove I'm telling the truth," she implored. But their expressions remained stern. Jenna felt the walls closing in again, her options dwindling. She was running out of time to clear her name. The detectives decided to investigate further and brought in the Wildlife Reserve's director. Jenna watched as a tall, grey-haired man entered the room, his face serious. He introduced himself as Mr. Harris, his eyes scanning the room and settling on Jenna. "We need your expertise," the female detective said, showing him the footage. Jenna's heart pounded. This was her chance to prove her innocence. She hoped the director would see the truth in her words. The director confirmed that a young, highly dangerous animal had recently escaped. "Yes, we had a wolf cub go missing a few nights ago," Mr. Harris said, his expression grim. "It's a serious matter. That animal can be very dangerous if not handled properly." He glanced at Jenna, his gaze softening slightly. "I can understand why you'd be scared if you found it," he added. Jenna nodded, feeling a small spark of hope. Maybe he believed her. He examined Jenna's story and the surveillance footage, noting her genuine confusion and fear. "She does seem genuinely distressed," Mr. Harris observed, looking closely at Jenna. "This doesn't look like someone who planned this." Jenna felt a flicker of relief. Finally, someone was considering her side. The detectives remained silent, watching the director closely. "Tell me again how you found the cub," he prompted Jenna, his tone encouraging. Jenna recounted her story, hoping it would be enough. The director expressed concern, but didn't fully exonerate Jenna. "I believe you didn't intend any harm," Mr. Harris said gently. "But this is still a serious situation. The law is clear about handling wild animals." He turned to the detectives. "She needs to be thoroughly questioned, but I don't think she's lying." Jenna's relief was tempered by his words. She still wasn't free from suspicion, but at least someone was finally listening to her. The detectives continued to question Jenna, seeking more answers. "Why were you near the reserve that night?" the female detective asked. Jenna shook her head. "I wasn't there. I don't know who that person is in the video, but it's not me," she insisted. The male detective leaned forward. "Is there anyone who can vouch for your whereabouts?" Jenna racked her brain. "I was home alone," she said softly. The detectives exchanged looks, their doubt evident. The director's testimony provided some relief to Jenna, suggesting she might be innocent. His words carried weight, and Jenna felt a tiny flicker of hope. "I believe her," Mr. Harris had said, his voice steady. The detectives, though still skeptical, seemed to consider his perspective. Jenna took a deep breath, feeling a bit of the weight lift off her shoulders. But she knew this was far from over. There were still many questions left unanswered. There were still unanswered questions about how the animal ended up in her yard. "How did the wolf cub get to your place?" the female detective asked, her tone less accusatory but still probing. Jenna shook her head, confused. "I have no idea," she replied honestly. "I just found it there, shivering in the bushes." The detectives exchanged glances. It was a critical piece of the puzzle they couldn't ignore. Jenna's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The vet's severe reaction remained a puzzling element in the case. Why did Dr. Thompson react so strongly? The male detective wondered aloud. Jenna shrugged, still bewildered by the vet's actions. "I don't know. He just freaked out when he saw the cub," she explained. "He said it was illegal and locked me in the room." The detectives noted this, recognizing it as another strange detail that needed further investigation. Jenna felt a shiver of uncertainty. The detectives promised to look into these inconsistencies, leaving Jenna in limbo. "We'll investigate further and get back to you," the female detective said. Jenna nodded, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. She was grateful they were taking her seriously, but hated the waiting. "Am I free to go?" she asked hesitantly. The detectives exchanged a look. "For now, yes, but stay available," the male detective replied. Jenna left the station, her mind still spinning with questions. Jenna's anxiety remained high as she waited for further developments. Each day felt like an eternity, filled with uncertainty and fear. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. Every time the phone rang, her heart leapt, hoping for news. She replayed everything in her mind, searching for anything she might have missed. The questions, the doubts, and the fear of the unknown gnawed at her relentlessly. Later, the detectives returned with a significant revelation about the animal's identity. "Jenna, we have new information," the male detective said, his tone softer. Jenna's heart raced as she waited for him to continue. "The animal you found isn't a wolf cub, it's a young lynx." Jenna's eyes widened in shock. A lynx? She had never imagined such a thing. The revelation brought a mix of relief and confusion. "But how did it end up in my yard?" she wondered aloud. Jenna found a young lynx, a highly dangerous and protected species that had escaped from a nearby wildlife reserve. The female detective explained, "Lynxes are rare and very protected. This one must have slipped out somehow." Jenna nodded, trying to process this new information. "I had no idea," she said, her voice shaky. The detectives shared a glance. This discovery added a new layer of complexity to the case, making it even more urgent to find out how this happened. The authorities initially suspected Jenna of being involved in the escape due to the rarity of the incident. "We had to consider all possibilities," the male detective admitted. "It's not every day a protected species like this goes missing." Jenna felt a pang of frustration mixed with fear. "I understand," she said quietly, "but I really didn't know." The detectives seemed to soften, realizing the gravity of the situation and the impact on Jenna's life. With new evidence, it became clear Jenna was just an unfortunate bystander. The female detective spoke up. "We found additional footage and testimony that supports your story. You were nowhere near the reserve that night." Jenna let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "Thank you," she whispered, tears of relief forming in her eyes. The detectives nodded, acknowledging Her life was forever changed by the ordeal, leaving her with a story she'd never forget. Sitting on her porch, Jenna reflected on the past few days. The fear, the confusion, and ultimately, the relief had left a deep mark on her. "I'll never forget this," she murmured, looking out at the peaceful yard. She felt stronger, more aware of the world around her. Life had returned to normal, but she knew she'd always carry this story with her.